I think all of us have uh, experienced what it's like to try and communicate in an email when you're not face to face with someone. And it's easy to be misunderstood. And it gets worse when you talk about a text message because they're so short. And we've seen times where we think we're saying one thing and someone takes it wrong, maybe gets offended, gets angry, uh, misses the point. And that's a problem. It's always a problem communicating. It gets harder when you're trying to write something. There's a balance that has to be struck. If you want to be perfectly understood, you can write a book, but it gets so long. If it's a personal message, it gets so long that people just won't read it all. And yet, if you get too short, it's easy to be misunderstood. As we study the scriptures, um, it's necessary at times to look at more than one place before we make up our mind. We have a good example of that this last week. Paul is about to leave on his second missionary trip. This is in Acts, and there's this young man, Timothy, and everyone speaks highly of him, and Paul thinks he needs to come along. And Paul, before they leave, has him circumcised. And we know that just the prior week, there was this big controversy over whether or not Gentile believers had to be circumcised. And the decision was no, they do not. But then we have this the following week, and it looks inconsistent. It looks hypocritical. And I tried to explain that because Timothy is the son of a Jewish mother and a Greek father, being a Jew means your mother was a Jew. That's how they determine it. So it says that Paul had him circumcised for the sake of, for the benefit of the Jews in the area, the people they were going to talk to. And it still seems inconsistent to some people. Even though it says specifically it's for their benefit. First thing I want to tell you is if Timothy had said, I don't want to do that, it's already been determined I don't have to, I don't want to. Paul would not have made him. I guarantee you he would not have tried to force it. It's not his place to force. But the thing you have to understand, and what I tried to explain about Paul, is that his mission, his purpose, was to present the gospel in terms that it would be understood and believed, accepted by his audience. And he changed the way he presents things. But at the end, I know there were people who were still uncertain, less than convinced. So I want to present something else to you. And this is why I started about the emails, about having to go to multiple sources. Sometimes we can get more enlightenment by looking at other words that Paul wrote himself. So I've gone to 1 Corinthians. This is chapter 9. The verses I'm reading are from 16 through about 27. Paul says an interesting thing. He says, though I am free of obligation to anyone, I make myself a slave to everyone to win as many as possible. And from that, the first thing you see is what's important to Paul, to win as many as possible. He becomes a slave to everyone. Now, he goes on to say, to the Jews, I became like a Jew to win the Jews. To those under the law, I became like one under the law, though I myself am not under the law, to win those under the law. To those without the law, I became like one without the law, though I'm not outside the law of God, but am under the law of Christ, in order to win those without the law. To the weak, I became weak, to win the weak. I've become all things to all people, so that by all possible means I might save some. Now, we've come to hear that term, be all things to all people, and we think about it as someone hypocritical. We think about it as someone who tells everyone just what they want to hear. But that's not at all what Paul is describing, and down deep, I think you must know it, but you read that, and it's hard not to knee-jerk. What Paul is talking about is completely giving up self, not being so stubborn about holding on to his own identity, his quirks, his uh, background. He's got some very impressive credentials. And yet, if he hangs on to that stubbornly and presents things in a way that people can't relate to, they miss the point. And you have to look at what's important to Paul. As always, it is to present the gospel in a way that the audience will understand it, relate to it, and believe, accept. He says, I do all this for the sake of the gospel so that I might share in its blessings. He goes on to talk about running a race. You run the race to win. Everyone trains, but the ones who train to win are the ones who are, in front at the end of the race. This is the way Paul viewed things. And it is this complete giving up of self that he's talking about. He's talking about meeting people where they are, presenting to people where they are. It's not the same thing we think of as trying to be all things to all people. The one other thing I want to mention is right up above there. Paul talks about his preaching. He's an evangelist. He preaches. It's not the same thing as teaching. Often when people are preaching, they skip around, and that's okay. They bring in things that prove the point. But when we're teaching one book of the Bible, one chapter, and going through it, if you skip around too much, it gets confusing, and it's a different process. What we do is teach. It's our job. I think it's our gift. It's something that we have to do. And we find it difficult when we skip around too much. We don't want to lose the flow of the thing we're teaching. But what Paul says, woe to me if I do not preach the gospel. If my preaching is voluntary, I have a reward. But if it is not voluntary, I am still entrusted with a responsibility. What then is my reward? That in preaching the gospel, I may offer it free of charge, and so not use up my rights in preaching it. For starters, that's kind of how we feel about teaching. It's why we do this house. It's why we've never asked for donations. We've never accepted any when they've been offered, because that's what we do. The idea that if I do it voluntarily, I have a reward, but even if I don't, I have a responsibility. And it's one of those things that when you have a responsibility, you can't abdicate it. You're still responsible. And that's one of the reasons weeks like this, where I feel like we've left some people less than satisfied. It's an obligation to try and go back. And I didn't skip all the way over last week into 1 Corinthians. But here we are. And what you see from this is more explanation from Paul. You see more than just one email or one text. And as you look at many of those, it's very consistent. The thing that's really, really important to Paul. And so we take it back to Timothy. If Timothy had said, I don't want to do this, Paul would have been satisfied. But Paul is in the business of being a slave to everyone, of saying, I'm giving up whatever I have to present this gospel. And if Timothy had not been willing to do it, he wouldn't have condemned him, but he probably would have said, this may not be the life for you. This is what we who are apostles, those sent out to carry the gospel, this is what we have to do. This is what we have to put up with. We have to give up self. And to his credit, that's exactly what Timothy did. Hopefully, in some instances, we can see our own way to do the same. I hope we're not called on to do some of the things that these people were, but we have obligations. I hope that cleared some of it up. I hope it satisfies some of you that still had some doubts. And I hope we see all of you next Sunday.